My name is Uzma Jamil. I am a visiting scholar at McGill University. My own work is on Islamophobia, racialization, and redness. Today I'm here as the moderator for this panel on Black education and the dilemma of culture and language. So we have three panelists today. I will read their bios up front. Each person will have 20 minutes to present, and then we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A this morning. So the first panelist is Clarence Bain. The title of his presentation today is Searching for an Identity, Home in Exile, Canadian Duality, and Color Line. Clarence S. Bain, a published poet, social economy theorist, and award-winning community activist, is Professor Emeritus, John Molson School of Business, Director of the Institute for Community Entrepreneurship and Development, and Senior Editor-in-Chief, International Journal of Community Development and Management Studies at Concordia. He's also President of the Black Community Resource Center and Chair of the Secretariat of the Black Community Forum. Our second panelist today is Tyrone Benskin. His presentation is titled Arts as Education and Identity. Tyrone Benskin is a former NDP Member of Parliament from 2011 to 2015, where he served as the official opposition's critic for Canadian Heritage and deputy critic in the official languages file. Mr. Benskin now has a significant presence in theater, film, television, and music, and his theater credits include feature appearances at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, the National Arts Centre, and the Centaur Theatre here in Montreal. Our third panelist today is Nigel Thomas. His presentation is titled Diversifying the Reading Curriculum. Nigel Thomas was born in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent in a place called Dixon, named after one of his colonial ancestors. He's a published novelist, poet, essayist, and organizer and co-host of Logos Readings. He's a retired professor of U.S. literature at the Université Laval. His latest novel will be released in November 2018 under the title Fate's Instruments, No Safeguards 2. So could we please begin with Professor Clarence Bain? Please.
Okay, my name is Clarence Bain. I am from the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago. I came to Canada to study in 1955, and as I very often say, I have been living in this country longer than 20 million people, and almost all the deputies and all the legislations of Canada longer than they were born. So I have in not recent years, but as a result, I define myself as a Canadian. A Canadian that has made a promise to himself of a condition of my living and continuing to live in this country is that it reflects me more. I already came here. When I came here, I was already reflecting this country as a result of my colonial heritage, so to speak. And I thought I had something to offer this country, and that as such it should reflect me. I'm going to approach this situation of what is often considered the problem of the black in North America and not specifically in Canada, not in terms of the numbers of how many blacks are here, how long they have been here, but in terms of the organizational arrangements that brought people together among those people, blacks, in the Western society into Canada. So I start by saying that, first of all, looking at the human being was developed systems of continuous search for food, shelter, security, and for meaningful and the ultimate truth. The satisfaction of all physical and biological needs are accomplished by systems of organizations, production, distribution, and consumption. Some systems can be classified as hunting, gathering, various market parliamentary economies, some certain types of mercantilist capitalism, central controlled economies. But in all forms, human labor and skills are central. While human labor, however, is an important source of value creation, through the creative imagination, we can produce and experience a non-material world, a spiritual existence. We take the position this morning that it is not sufficient to prove, to say that blacks were here in Canada before 1600, or try ad nauseum to prove that there was slavery in Canada and Quebec. We believe that we can learn more by exploring the systems of organization and the search by human beings to perpetuate life and improve the quality of life. What we ask are the set of behaviors and relationships best achieved by these objectives for all peoples, and the environment that sustains that quality of life. Now, the spiritual self is revealed to the arts, religion, and the normal belief systems in the social human systems. In this panel, my colleague Tyrone and Nigel will deal with the psychosocial side of fitness, the quality of life, the right and freedom to search and have access to justice, and the right to freedom of expression of the spiritual self. We consider this a human right. But while it is true that man shall not live by bread alone, it is interesting and informative to understand how he goes about securing bread. To understand how the need to eat, for shelter and security, for transport, capacity to search, may have created very uneven fitness landscapes where the highest peak are like the classical Canadian mosaic, likened by John Porter, to a vertical mosaic, or a sort of totem pole hierarchy, where it is shown that a coat and hem, the wasp occupied the top levels of the occupational and reward structure of Canadian society. Where the opportunities for education and social mobilities, where the opportunities for social and educational mobilities were unevenly distributed, with the French and other minorities generally at the bottom of the fitness hill. We ask the question, therefore, why today in Quebec there is a sort of inverted mosaic, with the French mostly at the top and blacks and other visible minorities and immigrants at the bottom, and those of British ancestry above, but at the lower rung. There is a legacy of colonialism and race superiority that we must consider as a system of the organization of the world if we are to truly get to the bottom of this. See, the black community in Quebec, and in particular the English-speaking black community, finds itself in a position of exceptional disadvantage, being black in one sense and speaking English in the other sense. This is a part of the legacy of the mercantilist triangular trading systems on which Quebec and the Maritimes benefited as hinterlands of settlement, linking them to the plantation economies of the West Indies. I draw strongly on the work of Capitalism and Slavery by Dr. Eric Williams. This system of slavery and colonial capitalism was supported, unfortunately, by doctrines of race superiority that considered blacks and other non-European peoples as savages incapable of being civilized or of creating civilizations. This, according to Professor Howard Palmer, in his paper, Reluctant Hosts, Anglo-Canadian Views of Multiculturalism in the 20th Century, explains the evolution of three forms of the emerging Canadian nation state. One is assimilation based on Anglo-conformity, that's early forms of Canadian development. The melting proletariat of assimilation, which is based on a new emergent culture based on the biological blending of immigrant groups. And finally, cultural pluralism or multiculturalism. So those concepts and theories of nation development emerge, we have blacks arriving. Now, it is important here for me to say you will go through Canadian history and you get a run almost chronologically of important dates and important events. The problem is that there's never in between that you will find that people like black people had anything to do with that or was involved in any way. So we would like to fill in those spaces a little bit. So blacks arrived in Canada largely as a part of the transatlantic and African trade in slaves. The early blacks were explorers and freemen. An example of them is Matthew da Costa. The largest earliest arrivals are slaves, of course, Oliver Lejeune and Marie-Joseph Angelique are frequently quoted as examples, and also some came as servants of the loyalists fleeing north. Some came as refugees from the American plantation slavery and as workers in the fur trade like George Bongo family and others of immigrants much later on in the development of Canada. I give you a few pictures that hopefully speak more than words. This is Matthew da Costa with Champlain arriving in Canada and the creation of Port Royal. It is said that it was his capacity to communicate in the language of the indigenous peoples and his communication skills in general that made it possible for Champlain and his to get access more easily than he would have normally. Here's Oliver Lejeune. He comes as a slave then there is the famous Marie-Joseph Angelique, a symbol of defiance against the indignities of slavery in Quebec. She is said to have set fire to Quebec in anger, and but there are other stories which suggest not Quebec to Montreal, burning half of the city or 1/3 of the city. But some people suggest that she did not do it, that it was an accident or her lover that did it and she was covering for this. Whatever it might be, however, she had become a symbol of defiance, a feminist defiance against the indignity and abuse of slavery. Of course, some came also as workers, and it was engaged in a significant numbers in the fur trade. According to Dr. Leo Berkeley, the George Bongo family represent one such family. They married into the indigenous population, and members of the family are believed to be still in Quebec. So the mercantilist system of production and trade, therefore, of unpaid African slaves denied blacks their human rights and human dignity. That's quite apart from the production and distribution and goods and between continents. One aspect of that form of that type of trade, a trade that in which wealth was believed to be limited, and basically you either had to take the resources that were available to create wealth from your neighbors if you wanted to have growth in a sense. So, but apart from that, the production of as we move towards a more sort of perfectly competitive market system, it became clear that production, wealth was not necessarily fixed. That if you had if you were productive and efficient and effective and innovative, that you can actually produce wealth. But it required large quantities of labor in necessary, where blacks were therefore basically taken out of Africa into to supply that labor. So, but this is a story that is in Canada and in Quebec in particular, is a general denial that we were ever involved in any such activity, and that and even if we did, we were not as bad as our American neighbors. So you never really get a history of Canada in which the transatlantic trade and the triangular trade that enrich the colonies of the West and Britain is told. What you get is a chronology of events internal to Canada, with the exclusion of these experiences. So in the British and French hinterland colonies of Canada, blacks were subjected to pervasive systems of social and economic exclusion and racial discrimination, generously described by Robin Waynes, Blacks in Canada, as benevolent neglect, and by the Canadian scholar and historian James W. Walker as the color line. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick map in here to give you a sense of the triangular trade that existed and that connected the colonies of Canada at the time to the West Indies, to Africa, and to the metropolis, England or France, as the case might be. This map shows you the trade routes, and it shows that these trade routes were much more extensive than we had imagined. As been detailed by Dr. Jamil Nelson of McGill University, you note that she has indicated that the routes did not just go from the Americas to Africa and from the Americas to France or Britain, that there was a significant trading routes that connected the colonies to the West Indies and to Africa. So this then in order to make it a little clearer, you can see here. Normally what we do is we see the red triangle. That's what we see. It's from the Caribbean to the American colonies to Africa. Trades come this way, sugar and goes to New England, and then products are sold in the slave trade exchange to the African traders on this side. However, there was an important triangular represented by the yellow, which shows that there was a trade, that there's a connection between the Maritimes, Newfoundland, and Quebec, which was with England, directly from England to the West Indies, and that is part of the of the triangular trade is not told. But that's a part of the triangular trade too, which historians from all have indicated and which they had produced wealth that, as they say, financed the Industrial Revolution of England and in large measure helped to enrich both the British and French colonies in Canada. It's against this background that I think we need to begin to look at Canadian history if we wish to fit the presence of blacks into Canada. How did blacks get to Canada? What is their relevance to Canada? Is their relevance only one that comes from their presence in Canada, or is their relevance much more significant that it comes from the wealth that they were able to produce of free labor in the plantations, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, which were used to finance development in the maritime of the time, as well as England. That is the context that we need to look at, and that's the context we do not understand. If we wish to understand why we are, how prejudice and discrimination exists in Canada, if we wish to understand why it is that certain groups have preference and other groups do not have preference, we need to understand the process by which Canada evolved and the role played by certain people in that development. We see, for instance, the repatriation of the Constitution in the Constitution Act of 1982, not simply as a linear progression of Canada towards a multiculturalism and an independence and disconnection from the old, their hinterland relationship to the metropole England. We see it as more than that. We as blacks see it as really the termination of the so-called triangular trade system, but it's one that did not bring the freedom that we expected. And why it did not bring the freedom that we expected? Because essentially, this was, as far as we are concerned, a settlement between two settler nations. The Francophone settler nation and the British settlers nation came together through a whole lot of incredible intrigues, by the way, to decide that Canada would remain a whole nation in which two people would continue to dominate. The settler, white British settler family and the French settler family. It did not come about essentially to free blacks or to give greater access and partnership to visible minorities and any other minorities. It came about to keep Canada together, and the way to keep Canada together was for the British to recognize the rights of the French and the French to recognize the rights of the British in Canada. And in 1760, when the French handed over most of Canada to the British, it is notable that the British, their conquerors, allowed them to keep their slaves and chattel. The same situation is remarkably present in this situation here. This was an arrangement between two mainstream settler classes of people, and everybody else was supposed to be subclasses of those. The whole concept of dual responsibility is offensive to us, because dual responsibility to us means we are subclasses of the two superior peoples And they are responsible for us because we, not just we, it could be true of the Indians, it's true of the First Nation people, it's true of Greeks, it can be true of the Italians, and everybody else is subclass to these two people, and they are responsible for us, and they are to ensure that the values of Canada remain vital and continue, and they are to take care of us. So that is the perspective from which we need to look at the history, and it's it's very interesting even as a researcher doing this, because as I say, I come from the Caribbean, and when I come here and I realize where the saltfish, where the pigtail, where the tripe, the pig guts, and where it came from, and what role I, as a child, eating these types of foods, the role I played in eating the bad saltfish, or what you call it, saltfish tail. My mother always used to say, Clarence, stop washing that saltfish, because you're going to wash away the fish and we have nothing. Right? So we got the tail of the saltfish, and the best part of the fish went to Rome and Europe, and that's where they made it. So from that perspective, I know that most Canadians do not see it from that perspective. From that perspective, however, I think we need to look again at the relationship of blacks and the contribution of blacks to Canada, the development of Canada, and the whole question beyond blacks as to what we mean by a partnership. Is it a partnership in which we are subclasses of the two major classes of people? Or is it truly a partnership of all Canadians, no matter where they come from, in the development of a new nation, a nation based on multiculturalism? So I'll show you that.
Thanks, Dr. May. Thanks to everyone who is here. Thanks to... Okay. My presentation, for the most part, is a recounting of my experience as an elementary school teacher. This was at École Barclay in 1986. 87 and 1987-88. The experience I'll talk about really occurred in 87-88. I'll comment briefly as well on an addendum that was made to the history curriculum in the 1990s in an attempt to put Black Canadians into the historical record. The issues I raise here, as well as other claims made by the proponents of multicultural curricula, need to be measured and validated. I have no doubt that the conclusions drawn from the experiences of those of us who've labored in the multicultural classrooms would be validated. And this, what I'm about to say, is important. Since I haven't applied any sort of scientific method to what I report here, you're invited to take it for what it's worth. I should also add that the account you're about to hear was written 30 years after the event. In those 30 years, much has been written about and tried in the area of multicultural education. In those years too, I became a writer of fiction, and some of that fiction focuses on how youngsters, particularly those of Caribbean descent, satisfy their need for valorization in the classroom and outside. All trained teachers have had at least one course in developmental psychology, and they know from the work done by people like Piaget, Erickson, and others that the elementary school years are crucial ones in which children develop self-confidence and self-esteem. Delelio, 1977. The general consensus is that when this is thwarted, quote, the child is ill-equipped to deal with, is ill-equipped to meet the challenges of adolescence, end of quote. Insofar as the experience of formal schooling plays a vital role in the development of a child's self-esteem and self-confidence, the curriculum should be so designed with this in mind. The student should be at the center of the curriculum. In fact, that's a fundamental tenet of all teacher training programs. In 1986, because of a penury of jobs for teachers like myself, I was then working in the Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal, and I was hired actually as an English teacher. And at some point, that job dried up as a result of the mass migration from the province following the '76 election. There were few jobs for English language teachers. I was then affected to French as a second language, and there the jobs began drying up as well. And eventually I was put in the elementary school sector, French mother tongue, and that's how I ended up at École Barclay. The school actually in which I taught had two populations, an English population and a French, education destined to an English, so-called English population, and education destined to a French population, which actually wasn't French. They were simply children who came here, parents who came here after the '76 election and had to send their children to a French school. Most of the kids I taught, in fact, I would say the classes were almost evenly divided between Greek and Haitian students. In those days, the school boards ran along confessional lines, and so Protestants actually went to, French-speaking Protestants did go to the French language sectors of the school, the existing school boards. Most classes would have had one or two Arab students, one or two Chinese students, one or two Vietnamese students. But by and large, for example, in my 87-88 class, there were 28 students, and all but 3 of them were either Haitian or Greek. There were 2 Chinese students in that class and 1 Vietnamese student. The first thing that struck me when I began at the school was the zeal with which my French-Canadian colleagues shamed the students caught speaking Greek, Creole, or English. The Greek kids were actually quite fluent in English. 86-87 was largely a year of observation for me. I had come to the elementary school after teaching 8 years in secondary school. Moreover, I just completed a PhD with a thesis that examined folk heroes and rituals in the Black American novel, and I understood, therefore, how basic this sort of culture was to a sense of self. The reading text for my grade 5 class, and that was the class I was assigned both years, was La lecture sur toutes ses formes, 4. In the exercises that accompanied the fragments of text, it was brilliantly conceived to develop the students' comprehension and reasoning skills. There was a major problem. The text on which these exercises were based had been chosen for students with a French-Canadian background. No such students were in my class in 86, 87, or in 87, 88. Of the extracts from more than 20 authors, There were about 6 that weren't French Canadian. Les 101 Dalmatiens, and the credit was actually given to Disney instead of the actual author, Dodie Smith. Les Enfants du Capitaine Grant, credited to Hachette rather than to Jules Verne. La Château de ma Mère, correctly attributed to Marcel Pagnol. Selections from the comics Asterix and Les Aventures de Tintin, and a very brief passage, Une course au tarot d'Alexandre Dumas père. Les Enfants du Capitaine Grant and le Wapiti of Quebecois novelist Monique Corriveau fitted what I call the European master narrative about black and brown peoples. In the case of the former, the Scottish travelers encounter cannibals and are saved by the good native. In the case of the latter, there are the Indians who torture French Canadians. My recent research in African American folklore sensitized me to the fact that the lecture sous toutes ses formes was alien to my students' ontology. The school had a library. Most of the books were in English from the time when the school was entirely English. The more recent books by best-selling young people's authors, Judy Blume, for example, were present in French translation. Over the summer of 1987, I decided to modify the reading curriculum. I acquired Conte chinois, Conte esquimaux, Mythes et légendes de la Grèce antique. In my library, I had several Francophone Caribbean authors. I found passages in Stephen Alexis's books that might appeal to my Haitian students. In my 87-88 class, I was fortunate to have a few students who were reading beyond grade level. I gave them 3 passages, one from Patrick Chamoiseau, he's Martinican, by the way, Chronique de cette misère, one from Alexis's Compère général de soleil, and another from L'Espace d'Enseignement, and asked them for their opinions. They responded enthusiastically and told their classmates about them, and their classmates clamored to have them read to the class. I obviously couldn't go to the principal and ask for funds because, as you probably know, the materials taught in the classroom are pre-approved, and you really have to have approval for materials that you use in the classroom. So, of my own accord, I just simply photocopied these at my own expense, and we use them in the class. The extract from L'Espace d'Enseignement features 2 characters, Madame Punes and El Culcho, who initially argue about the meanings of dreams. And these are set actually in Haiti. And the whole turns out to be a contest of wills. And this actually got the students talking about dreams, the students in their different, from their different traditions, certainly. In fact, I remember the Vietnamese boy specifically talking about his aunt being on a boat and his mother having a dream that something terrible had happened, and a few days later they got a message that their aunt had died, and it got a lot of discussion going. But in fact, I saw in that particular class, that particular discussion was that the students can communicate across their different ethnic divisions. The passage from Compère général de soleil actually describes a voodoo ceremony. And the Haitian students were really, really interested in this. They identified the different gods and told their Greek classmates what they were all about, and so on and so forth. This was followed by mythes et légendes du grec antique, and here I chose the Midas myth and the Persephone myth, and of course the Greek students had an opportunity then to talk about their particular legends and so on. But the discussion went over to the Haitian students in the sense many of them were Adventists and Pentecostals, and so they knew their Bible, and they brought in Dives, for example, from their Christian tradition, and the whole business of greed and so on and so forth became a discussion, again, across ethnic, from a multi-ethnic position. In the case of the Persephone myth, one of the things that we were able to do was to sort of say, well, how would this myth be different, for example, if it weren't written, if the tale hadn't been written by Greeks, but rather by the Inuit, for example, and they were able to make the connection, and so on and so forth. The extract from Patrick Chamoiseau was somewhat different in the sense that it spoke about a slave master who, on the eve of the abolition of slavery, decided to store all of his possessions, his wealth, money, etc., gold pieces, in a jar, and have his most trusted slave guard it. And he tells his most trusted slave, okay, tomorrow you'll be free, but today I want you to accompany me into the forest, and you will help me bury my possessions, and you will be its guardian. They go into the forest and they do dig the hole, and the slave that digs the hole, and he's at the bottom of the hole, and the jar is put in, and as the slave attempts to come out, the master cracks his skull, kills him, and buries him in the hole. Very violent story. I suspect that those who define curriculum for the school board would not have approved of it. But what it allowed us to talk about was the cruelty of slavery. And the Haitian students certainly got an opportunity then to talk about their own revolution, about Toussaint Louverture, etc. I had one selection from Concordia of a character called Juan, who in fact encounters the génie du tonnerre. And essentially, Juan, who is a very good person, meets this character who is hungry and feeds him, and he eventually finds out that he is in fact the génie du tonnerre who rewards his generosity, and so on. And the students, youngsters, they responded very, very well to this. But the point of the story really was so that the Chinese students in my class could feel that their reality was represented. What actually, an interesting thing happened in the sense that my students then began talking. There were 3 grade 5 classes in the school. My students then began talking to their friends in other grade 5 classes, and they then began asking their teachers, why aren't we doing stuff like this in our classes? I should say, even when the principal found out about it, he supported me. The vice principal, who actually was French-Canadian independentist and all of that, told me that I was, doing something that was illegal, that was not approved by the school board, etc., 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 and so on and so forth. Her position was that the students were here and that it was French-Canadian or, Quebecois culture that they should be learning. Now, I wasn't indifferent to this. In my classroom, financed by myself, I had lots and lots of texts by French-Canadian authors, Henriette Major, for example. The students liked the selections in the Reader by Félix Leclerc, so I acquired his Allegro, Andante, Adagio, which they borrowed quite freely and used. There was also Conte de Mon Pays, which I had in the classroom among other books. And so that was my experience. I intended to talk a little bit about what happened. I left at the end of that school year, so unfortunately I could not replicate the experience because I then got hired by University Laval, and that was it. When I told the students at the end of the year that I was going, they were absolutely angry with me. In fact, the brother of one of the students in my class came and said, "Monsieur, vous partez, vous nous abandonnez, qui va nous," etc., etc. But that was certainly it. When I returned to visit the school the following year, I met one of my students who said, "Monsieur, je suis en train d'écrire un roman sur vous." And so it's a very wonderful experience. The point I'm making is that students needed to feel comfortable, needed to see themselves reflected in the classroom, and that actually was what I tried to do, and so on. I know that in later years, quite a few teachers, black teachers in particular in the Protestant school board and other English language school boards, demanded that we be included in the history. And they came up with this document, Some Missing Pages. And for a while it was being used in the history curriculum. And in fact, there were even a few questions in the provincial exam that reflected the materials. And then my friend and ex-colleague Horace Goddard told me that once the teachers who had put it in place left, it simply became, nobody used it anymore. And now, in effect, Some Missing Pages, the title of the document, now is completely missing from the curriculum. Of course, we all know what is going on with the debate at the moment about whose history should be taught in schools. Thank you very much.
Hello. My name is Taro Bensky. I am not an academic by any stretch of the imagination, but I've spent much of my career using the tools that I have to make my presence as a person of African descent more relevant, both for myself and for the community around me. I'm an artist, I'm an actor, director, former member of parliament, and for me all of these things work together. from different directions, but they all work together. For me, they all work together in an effort to carve out an identity. Why is that so important? If I say, I am a Jew, if I say, I am Italian, if I say I am French Canadian, to all of you, that means something. You can, from there, draw on different elements of history, different elements of self as to who these people are. If you say, I am a black man, what does that mean? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to the person that is looking at me and saying, well, that's a black man? In today's context, it generally means that the American idea of blackness, and I use that term within quotations, is usually put on me. When people ask me where I was born in Bristol, England. I say I was born in England. Yes, but where are you from? And I've tested this. When they say, well, where are your parents from? I'll say England. And they will keep going until I get back to Adam and Eve. And then they'll sort of ease up. My parents are from Barbados, by the way. But that sense of identity is something that we've spent the better part of 300-400 years searching for. It's only recently that we can actually look at the Americans and say, there is a culture that you can say, or you can define as African American. It's a shared experience, shared history, shared music, even shared language to a certain extent. All of these elements go into creating a culture. But it took a lot of years to even get to that part. During the 60s and the 70s, everybody was running around with afros and wearing dashikis and wanting to go back to the motherland and all of these things, hoping to find that sense of self. And why is that so important? Because that's the root of how we do things. When we wake up in the morning, that's the root of our identity, knowing who we are and where we came from. I was blessed to have two incredible parents who kind of set roots for me. And I know that I come from my mother and my father, and every day I see traits of my mother and my father and my grandparents, or my grandmother, that's the only one that I knew, in me. Those are my roots. And from that I was able to, put my feet forward and create and do the things that I wanted to do. This is something that I think is vital and missing in our education. And I think arts is the glue that holds that together, that brings that together. Through the arts, what we're not getting in our education system, such as this, such as the information that Dr. Bain was sharing with us before. Through the arts, we can find those stories. And this is what it all boils down to. We are all our stories. And if our stories have been hidden or destroyed, as they have been, if they are not shared from the point of the very young, as was practiced by Nigel in the classroom, then that thing that brings us together, that thing that links us together, is lost. And then we run around looking at everybody as being different. And why are you different? And why aren't you doing things the same way that I do? And why, and conflict comes from that. The stories that we're able to find through the arts and practice through the arts are invaluable. As the artistic director of Black Theatre Workshop, one of the goals that I set for myself was to find some of those stories and bring some of those stories to life. One of the stories that I found was a story of a man named Joseph Boulogne, who is also known as the Mosaic Noir. He was born in the 1750s to a woman from a slave from Guadeloupe and a man from Paris. This man, his father, sent him to school in Paris. Joseph became a virtuoso violinist. In his lifetime, he created over 200 works. He, including, I think, 2 operas. He was the conductor of 2 orchestras, of his own orchestras. One of the things is that the way that we set up symphony orchestras today is based on how he set it up in his day. He also had a chamber orchestra. He was one of Marie Antoinette's music teachers. He was a colonel in the French Revolution after spending a few years in prison because the revolutionaries thought he was an aristocrat. He was black, but he talked his way out of that and became a colonel. His second in command, incidentally, was Alexandre Dumas Sr., who was the father of Alexandre Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers. He was mixed race. These things aren't told in schools. These stories aren't told in schools. These stories allow the people that they speak to, the people that they come from, to feel a part of what goes on in the world. For centuries, our children, the children from the black community, by omission and by action, were told we didn't belong. We didn't belong here. We don't belong here. We see what's happening in the States today. We don't belong there. We don't belong. Go back to Africa, and so forth. The stories of our contributions to the building of nations, to building of this nation, to building of all nations, of protecting those nations through the various wars, including the War of 1812, including the Civil War, including the First World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the First World War, the Second World War, are neglected. When we remember our heroes, the contribution of people of African descent is neglected. What does that say to our children growing up? What does that say to us as adults when we try to find our place in this world? That we don't belong. This is why I feel that arts as a tool, as an education tool, can go a long way to helping to shed light on many of those stories. And there are a lot more stories that are out there other than Angelique and other than and talking about Martin Luther King during Black History Month and Harriet Tubman during Black History Month, all of which, I wouldn't be, many of us wouldn't be here if not for the efforts of these people. But there are more people that have contributed to the building of this nation. Dr. Bain mentioned earlier about the Empire Loyalists. There were some 8,000, between 8,000 and 12,000 black United Empire Loyalists who came up as free persons after the Revolutionary War. Free. There were some who were slaves, but the vast majority were free. They settled in Nova Scotia. They were given land by the crown. Now, they weren't welcome. They were burnt out of their homes. They built cities. They were successful. They were successful because they weren't allowed to charge as much for goods and services as their white counterparts. So a shoemaker who was doing very good work couldn't charge as much as the white counterpart. So what happened? The people from the white villages went to the black shoemakers. They became successful. They became affluent. They started newspapers. They started communities. They started their own councils. And then they were burnt out because they were so successful. Many moved inland, settled in Windsor, Ontario, southern Quebec, and some went further west. There were blacks who who left what was then called the Indian territories to come up and settled in Alberta, settled the Salt Spring Islands out in Vancouver. Bishop Estes, or Reverend Estes, who was the founder or the first preacher of the Union United Church here in Montreal, was actually a direct descendant of one of the prominent families who settled the Salt Spring Islands in BC. These are bits of history that go a long way to showing how integrated the building of this nation was. And through the arts, these things I learned, incidentally, from doing plays. People finding these stories and my participating in this. And from that, I would pick up a book or two and read and find out more. But if not for, again, my father was an avid reader. He bought the, little side story, he bought the, the World Book Encyclopedia. My mother was really mad. But somebody came to the door and he bought it. Do you know my father read every single one of those books from from cover to cover? You know, my father wasn't an educated man. He was a machinist, but he was one of the wisest people, is one of the most wisest people I know. And he loves to sit there and talk trivia. And that's where he gets his information. And I kind of get that from him. Pick up a book, my mother would say, and my father would say. But that is the only way that I learned these things. I shouldn't have to only learn them on my own. And I think it's not only important for people, myself, for young men and women of color to know these stories, but people from the greater community, so they understand better who their neighbors are, why their neighbors are. Why do we eat what we eat? Why do we sing what we sing? You know, I've always had the adage, the best way to know a person is to eat their food and listen to their music. And it still holds true. When you listen to folk music from any culture, it's something that moves you. Any culture. When you eat food from any culture, as weird and strange as it may seem, when you understand where that comes from, why those things happened. Dr. Bain alluded to saltfish and pig's feet and pigtail and so forth, and being West Indian, I'm all too familiar with it. But growing up in England until I was 9, it was the worst thing for me. I couldn't deal. I couldn't deal for many, many years. But when I began to understand where it came from, then there was a different appreciation for it. But when we look at food, for example, and I look at food as being an art form, in and of itself. You look at corn. In Africa, you have a thing called fufu, which is basically a porridgey type thing made from corn. The West Indies, or Barbados in particular, you have cuckoo. Right? Sorry? Yes, without it. Yeah, I don't like okra either. Cuckoo, which is the same thing. You have grits in the South. In my journeys to Africa, there were various other African foods. You take the same food source. You take cod. In Portugal and Italy, you have bacalhau. In West Indies, you have saltfish, and in Jamaica, you have ackee and saltfish. These are because of the trade routes that Clarence was talking about. Because cod they would catch cod in Newfoundland, send it out to the Caribbean, it would be dried and so forth, and then brought back to the New World. And it was traded for rum, because in the islands they found sugar cane. And they found this thing, when you boil it a lot and ferment it a lot, you get this thing called rum. And people liked that. Sailors like that. And people kind of look at sailors as being, I digress a bit, but being alcoholic, but they couldn't drink water because you couldn't, you couldn't drink water because you couldn't transport enough water. So you drank fortified wine, which was port, thanks to the Portuguese, or you drank rum to stay alive. All of this was part of the triangle that we were talking about. All of these are the incredible stories that live out there that nobody knows about, that we within our community are learning about, and within the greater community need to start finding and discovering. We can do that through the arts and bringing arts into the education system and making it a requirement to graduate, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll lobby there for that forever, is a very important thing, because it speaks to who we are as people. It's not just information, it's not just actions, it's not just this thing happened on this date. It's why this thing happened and how were people affected by this happening. So I will end right there. Thank you.
So I have a question. Russell Copeman, Executive Director of the Quebec English School Boards Association. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your presentations. I've known Dr. Bain long enough to be able to call him without sounding too familiar, Clary. But
I'll allow you to call me Clary.
thank you, I appreciate it. You know, that old adage that if people don't know the past, we're doomed to repeat it, comes to mind. You all spoke very eloquently about the past and your experiences in the past. I learned a great deal. Some of what you spoke about I knew, and some I did not. But my real question is, in a few moments, is where do we go from here? How do we, you know, you dealt, as I say, very eloquently with the past, and the lessons of the past are important. But part of my job is to try and think about the future. And you know, I understand the importance of adapting programs, not just because, you know, here in Quebec, of course, programs are mostly, almost exclusively developed in French initially. There's a strong tendency merely to translate them when they need to be adapted. And I think what you gentlemen, you know, have demonstrated is not only do they need to be adapted for the English school system, but they also have to be adapted to be pertinent to the students who are in those classes. And if you don't do that, you're failing them as pedagogues, and the school system is failing them. So where do we go from here? How do we ensure that the situations you've described are not perpetuated? Not all I do, but I go to a lot of meetings, and I meet with stakeholders, and I meet with representatives from the Department of Education. I meet with everybody practically who moves in education. And in those institutional settings, including directors general of school boards, senior administrators, etc., I have yet to come across a black person. So, what, you know, where do we go from here?
I suspect your question is addressed to me. Is that it, to everyone? Okay, I don't really know how to answer that question, because in a way, I'm just too acutely aware of how power is distributed in the society. And I'm not sure really, you know, we're at this point, we're obsessed with what sort of religious symbols people would be allowed to wear. And I'm sure you know that there is a tremendous hostility here towards the very concept of multiculturalism. I'm told, for example, I work in the arts, not professionally, just out of an interest, I mean, a hobby sort of thing. And I'm often told, if you apply for a grant to bring a writer, don't ever use the term multiculturalism, because you probably won't get it from the calc. I mean, honestly, I don't know, because people, it's not that blacks and other ethnic groups don't get into the system. It's just that when you get into the system, you don't in any way control the agenda. There are bigger concerns. I mean, the English community here cannot quite get the French community to understand why the history that is being taught in the schools should greater reflect them. Just imagine when it comes down to blacks, so that more or less is a problem that I cannot provide an answer for, honestly.
I would say the first order of business is inclusion, which I was alluding to. If I sit in a classroom, and I think, I don't speak for everybody, but I can speak for people that I know, if I sit in a classroom and nothing that's happening is not so much about me, but includes me, then I see no point in being there. And if people at that level are not, if people from the African Canadian, I don't know if that means anything, but the people of African descent are not participating as well, it's because there is a sense of why. Nothing I do is going to affect anybody, or anything that I put forward is not going to be supported. And it's not going to be supported because of the fact that nothing, and this is nothing in society, this is huge. You watch television, whatever you see is something that says, you don't belong. I remember it's grown up a bit, and I've been doing this for 30 years, so I've seen the growth. But I remember the first time I saw there was a McDonald's commercial. I was watching some show, it was an American Black show, and the McDonald's commercial came on, and every single solitary person in that McDonald's commercial was black. And that's the only place that you saw that commercial. I think it was the Cosby Show, sorry. When you're isolated in that way, and you don't feel that anything that you do is going to contribute or be heard, then it's problematic.
Tyrone, I understand. You're explaining why,
Yeah.
and I respect that.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to go. Well, okay. Now what?
Then I would say inclusion, and I would basically say the fight is to make sure that history is included, because that's the only way that a student sitting, a 5-year-old in a class, is going to say, I enjoy going to school, like the students that Nigel was talking about before.
But I think you need help too.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
the least you need is for me not to continue to be aggressively involved. I mean, we have, in some of the cultures, you have people who are so ready to adapt to what they to play the game, to borrow from the characteristics of they that are in power, hopefully that it will be a success story to them. It's a multi, in the first place, unfortunately, whoever made us made a mistake. Not us, all of us. They made us to fear anything external to us, and to be totally focused on survival, or whatever it means. But somewhere along the line, we've happened to develop a spiritualism, which is a conscience, and a wisdom which simply says, I don't necessarily have to kill the guy, maybe I can work with him. But it has to be a continuous, ongoing, aggressive effort. You cannot accept the status quo. And you have to be prepared to pay the price of your immediate gratification in order to look, there have been changes. We sit here, we do not just sit and say that this country hasn't changed. There have been incredible changes. But like every human being, everything is relative. We're not satisfied with where we are. We need to have more change. We have to need more improvement. We haven't hit that spiritual togetherness that We may never get back to the Garden of Eden, but we can keep on trying.
In the community, there's a saying, if you can see it, you can be it. Many cultures have that. The thing is, we don't see it as much as we need to. This is why it's so important to bring it in to the schools, because if kids can see the accomplishments of people like them, they then can dream to be those things. One anecdote: when Tiger Woods won the golf, when he won the Masters, the green jacket, reportedly in New York and Detroit, the enrollment in golf schools by young black men, young black boys, just went through the roof. Because golf was one of the last bastions of places where it was considered whites only. There were still golf clubs that you could not get into if you were black.
There still are, probably.
There probably still are, not on paper, but in practice. But when Tiger Woods won the Masters, when he was winning, that was one thing, but when he won the Masters, enrollment just went skyrocketing up. They saw it, and they could be a part of it. Same thing with the Williams sisters in tennis, or Arthur Ashe, actually, way back when, too. But when they see it, they can be it. I was overwhelmed. When I was going to theater school, it was me and Gary Jean. I don't know if you remember Gary Jean. That was it in theater school. But I persevered and I've made a modicum success. But there are young people who are coming up to me and saying they're in theater school now, or they're acting now, against their parents' wishes and everything else, because they saw me on stage. Now for me, that's kind of an overwhelming thing. But it just proves to me that for our community, when you see, for women even, when you see somebody being successful at something that they were shut out of, they then have the dream. So to change that, more of that needs to be seen. Ways of bringing these people into schools, job fairs and things of this nature.
A good example is the Black Theatre Workshop, for instance, where in 1960, Canada told us, you know something, you all are good at animation, but I'm not sure whether you're good at theatre. Today, we're funded by every funding agency in the country. I mean, federal, provincial, etc., and others. I mean, we went to the schools and basically looked at this, we were crazy. We couldn't even get one. Now we're in 45 schools. Every summer, 45 schools. I mean, the same people who consider us to be good at animation but not theater have just won 3 years and something like that, 10, 12, something like 35 meters. And in 3 consecutive years have won Best Production of the Year. And it's not charitable. It's certainly not charitable. But the important thing now, what I say to the black community and people in the black community, or in any community, you have not a responsibility to prove anything, but you have a responsibility to systematically organize whatever resources are available to you to advance yourself, to ensure your own survival and reproduction, and to ensure that nothing stands in the way of your spiritual evolution. It's your responsibility to do that and to address any opposition, whatever there is. And I'm not talking about violence, I'm talking about if you don't have routes to go to the ocean, then swim on the ocean, put a tube underneath and crawl to the tube, whatever you have to do.
You mean like break down the door?
That too.